Hello everyone, this is Ashley Tucker from My Favorite Things. I have a birthday card to share with you today. I'm going for a very bold graphic style design with this card, and it is right up my alley. I really like the way that this card turns out. All right, to start out, I have a piece of black cardstock, and that is currently cut to 5.5 by 5.5. And I used a powder bag to wipe the whole paper down because I'm embossing on it. I taped it to a stencil. This is the Diagonal Stripes stencil. And then I am just pressing my Versamark ink pad into it. Just pressing down and then straight back up, trying not to really rub it because if you rub it, it's going to move the stencil and you don't want to move the stencil. I did move the stencil a little bit right here, and you can see that I'm just using a craft pick and rubbing away all of that powder that ended up in places where I didn't want it. The embossing powder that I'm using is just a clear embossing powder. Now you could achieve a very similar look to this by using a clear glossy embossing paste. Of course, you have to wait a long time for that to dry, and this is a lot quicker. I do think that the embossing paste looks a little bit nicer, but this is so much faster. So this is kind of the cheater's way of getting that same look. I trimmed that piece down to 5 by 5, and now I am using Distress Oxide ink in the color Salty Ocean, and I'm using a blender brush to blend that on all of the edges, and I am blending it softly so it kind of fades out towards the middle of the cardstock. So I'm adding kind of a vignette look here. Once I finish going around the whole border with that, I'm going to grab a clean cloth and I'm going to wipe all of the areas that I just added that ink. And this is because that Distress Oxide ink is going to actually sit right on top of the embossed areas. The embossed areas do resist the ink, but the ink is still sitting on top of it. So if you don't want the ink there, you're going to have to wipe it off. And I don't want the ink on top of my embossing. I just want the ink on the areas that don't have the embossing to create a very interesting look. And then I'm going to do the same exact thing with some Twisted Citron Distress Oxide ink, but I did add that a little bit more sparingly. I do think it's difficult to fully appreciate this on camera. It looks beautiful in person, that really subtle blue and green vignette around the edges. I love this. For my large sentiment, I'm using an older stamp, but it is one that is still available on the MFT store. This is just called Happy Birthday, and it's a nice big scripty happy birthday sentiment. And I'm embossing that with white on some black cardstock. And then the great thing about this sentiment is that it has a die set that goes with it. And you can cut around the stamp sentiment. Or if you prefer, there is a die in the die set that cuts out the word, so you can use a die instead of stamping. I decided to take that same die that I cut my sentiment out with, and I cut it 4 times out of some white cardstock. And I'm gluing all of those pieces together with some liquid adhesive, and then I'm going to glue my stamped sentiment right on top of that to make a really thick sentiment. This is kind of like those chipboard sentiments that you can pick up. I really like the dimension that it gives, and it's going to look really cool on top of my black background. All right, so I cut out a card base. This is a 5.5 by 5.5 top folding card base, and I'm popping up my background on that with some foam tape. I added some liquid adhesive to the back of my dimensional sentiment, and I stuck that down to the background, kind of a little bit towards the top. Next, I'm going to create a few smaller sentiments to go around my larger one. For that, I did pull out the Itty Bitty Birthday stamp set. Now, I don't believe that this is currently available on the website right now. You could put in your email to wait for it to become available, but you can also substitute these with any smaller sentiments that you have in your set that go with birthdays. I stamped 2 of these smaller sentiments. Both of them I stamped in Versamark ink and embossed with white embossing powder. One of them on a blue cardstock and one of them on a green cardstock. And then I used a sentiment die to cut them out, and I'm popping them up around my happy birthday sentiment. The die that I used to cut out these sentiments comes from the Skinny Strip die set. Now I'm going to take that same die and I'm going to cut it out of 2 more colors of blue cardstock. And as you can see, when I'm putting this on my die plates, I'm letting the edge of one side hang out so that the top plate isn't covering it. And that's because I want to make this a little bit longer. So I'm going to adjust it. As you can see, the die didn't cut through where the top plate wasn't on top. So I'm going to use my trimmer and I'm going to very carefully line this up. And you got to be very careful not to get your fingers in there when you're using the trimmer. And I'm just going to trim off the sides to extend the length of this on one side. And off camera, I did the same exact process with another color. I did it with a very, very light blue piece of cardstock. So now I have 2 of these strips with flags on the side. I added some foam tape to the back of both of these strips, and I'm going to very carefully line them up underneath that bottom sentiment. And I really like the way that this adds some more color to the card, and it also really balances out the card because there was a little bit too much space on the bottom there. To finish up the card, I'm just adding a few of these enamel dot stickers around the larger sentiment, and then it's all done. And in this closer shot of the card, you can really see the dimension on that larger sentiment. I really like the way that that turned out. I think it really pops. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you really enjoyed this card design and that it gave you some inspiration and ideas for your own cards. I hope you have a wonderful day today, and I'll see you next time.